Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best in macro and markets thinking. To see our latest thoughts and analysis on the world, visit macrohive.com. We're coming up to our 1-year anniversary at Macro Hive, and we'll soon be doing some fun stuff to celebrate, including sending books to all of our subscribers. So if you're not a paid subscriber yet, make sure to sign up. And through becoming a member, you'll get access to all our original articles, like this week's pieces on how US protests will affect President Trump, the dollar path, and unemployment trends in the US. You also get our summaries of the best academic work too. This week, we looked at the literature on the pros and cons of negative interest rate policies, or NIRP, by central banks. You'll also get our curations of the best macro blogs and podcasts. And, of course, you have access to our subscriber-only Slack chat rooms where we all talk markets. You get all of this for the cost of a coffee or two a week. I think it's great value, so please do sign up. So on to our podcast show. In this episode, we have Professor Alex Edmans from the London Business School. He's one of the world's leading academics on companies' purpose, social value, and profits. In fact, he's just come out with a book on the subject called Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. We had a wide-ranging discussion talking about how social value and purpose increases profits, whether share buybacks deliver value or not, and should executive pay be capped, and how evil is the financial sector, amongst other things. So on to our conversation. Alex, welcome to our podcast, and thanks for making the time to be with us.
It's great to be here, Bilal.
I thought rather than jumping straight into your academic work and your recent book, I thought maybe we could talk a bit about your background, because you have somewhat of an unusual background for an academic in the sense that you started off in investment banking. So you started off, I'd say, on the dark side before you moved over to the light side. So do you want to kind of talk us through your background after university and then also the reason why you left banking?
Sure. So I studied economics and management at Oxford. And why I even study that to begin with is that when I did my A-levels, I did unusually both arts and sciences. I did English, German, economics, and maths. So what I liked about economics was the fact that you do have some theories there, but you also have some ability to argue. So there's no one right answer. And so I like that fact that there was the ability to debate. And so investment banking was great in many ways, in that it gave you the opportunity to work on really big problems. So even as a first-year analyst, the conversations I was having with quite senior people within clients were really gratifying. So I know there's a lot of other ex-investment bankers who say, oh, I was beaten up the whole time and treated really badly. I was treated really well at Morgan Stanley, and I enjoyed that. So then why did I choose to leave? So I remember there was one time when I worked in a deal with Abbey National being the client. We were selling one of their businesses. And after we did the sale, the Financial Times the next day was fantastic. It had the front page being the sale and what a great deal it was. And then the day afterwards, the headline was something different. And I thought, well, I've spent 7 months of my life dealing with one company's problems at one time, which sort of affected the news for one day. Obviously, there's a permanent impact after that. But I thought, well, my contribution here has been great to that one company, but a little bit narrow. Whereas as a professor, if you write a paper, that could be timeless. It could apply to all countries in all industries at different points in time. So it was more to have the greater impact in terms of bandwidth.
And did you find the transition hard to go from a corporate commercial environment to an academic environment?
I actually found it really difficult in my first year. So I did my PhD at MIT in the US. And I'd done economics as an undergrad, as I mentioned, but in the UK, they teach it like an essay subject. So you discuss, should the UK join the single currency, or what are the benefits of central bank independence? Whereas in the US, they teach economics a bit like engineering. So you set up profit functions and differentiate them. And so I found the technical aspect, the math side, pretty hard right at the start. So I had to enroll myself in a remedial math course in order to deal with that technical side. But I think that was useful because it means that even though the issues that I wrestle with, and I'm sure we're about to talk about, are really human qualitative issues, what math gave me was not just the ability to differentiate, but the clarity of thinking and the importance of being rigorous. Because when we think about things such as purpose, it's very easy to shoot from the hip and say sort of what makes sense and what sounds good. But what sounds good may not actually be borne out when you look at the data or when you think about things rigorously.
And so when you picked your field within academia, was it very clear that you'll be focusing on the value of companies, the purpose of companies, and so on?
Well, absolutely not. So actually, the first paper I ever wrote was something that many people who might know my research on purposeful business won't be aware of this. It was on the effect of soccer results on the stock market. So what I wanted to show was that the market is not efficient. It's driven by emotions rather than fundamentals. And why I looked at the effect of World Cup elimination is that something which affects investor sentiment, but it doesn't affect fundamentals. And so what I showed was that when a country is knocked out of the World Cup, the stock market falls significantly the next day by something massive, by about £10 billion. But then how did I move from something that crazy to purposeful business? Well, if indeed markets are inefficient, then that has broader implications. Because if markets were efficient, then the stock price of a company would be fully forward-looking. It would take into account things such as employee satisfaction or efforts to combat climate change, purpose, and so on. Therefore, maximizing short-term profit would be the same as maximizing social value because the short-term stock price would take all of those things into account. But when you allow for the fact that markets might be inefficient, there might be intangible factors which are not part of the short-term stock price, and therefore there is a difference between shareholder value maximization and then long-term societal maximization, which got me into the interesting topic of purpose.
And I guess in some ways, the culmination of a lot of your work in this area is this new book that you've recently published called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. Came out, I think, in March, and I assume you must have been working on it for many years before that.
The book took 2 years to write, but actually it was a culmination of about 13 to 15 years of research that I'd done myself, but also research done by many other scholars. And what I also wanted to do in the book is not just put the business case for purpose, but also the business case against purpose, is I wanted to give both sides of the coin sort of equal play, and it was the culmination of all the research that I and loads of other people had done, which I put together. So the 2 years there was not doing just primary original research, it was synthesizing what was already there in a simple, practical framework.
Earlier you sort of mentioned, profit maximization for companies, and one conventional, I would say, understanding of the purpose of a company is simply to maximize profits. All the other things like employee satisfaction, climate change, or meeting environmental goals and those sorts of things, there's a sort of sense by many people that that's kind of a nice to have. That might be a marketing gimmick, or it may just be the personality of the management may sort of suit that. But ultimately, it's profit that matters. How do you answer that kind of question?
I think the first step in answering it is actually to take seriously the idea that the goal of a business might be to maximize shareholder value. So often when people want to attack capitalism, they will point to the Milton Friedman article 50 years ago, the social responsibility of business is to increase profit. And they'll say, well, look how narrow-minded this view is. It says just focus on profit, not the things like employee satisfaction and climate change that you were just mentioning. But that's really unfair because actually that Friedman article is much more nuanced than one might believe. Because why he said it is okay for a company to just focus on profit is that, well, the only way to generate profit, at least in the long term, is if you invest in your workers and if you treat your customers well and if you don't pollute the environment, because if you do all those things, your brand will be hurt. So he was absolutely not advocating exploiting everybody else in the pursuit of profit. In fact, he recognized that being responsible could be profitable. So then you might think, well, how does my view differ from that? Well, I think the important thing is going back to the idea of market efficiency, which is what we mentioned earlier. So if indeed the market was efficient, then indeed the stock price of a company would take into account everything the company was doing in terms of maximizing its impact on society. But because many of those social dimensions are intangible, it's really hard for an investor to know, how do I change cell C23 in my Excel spreadsheet to account for the fact that my employees feel psychologically safe when they come to work? Now, if it was a machine, right, and the machine produces certain number of more widgets, I could calculate the sales from those widgets and add that to cell C23, but something intangible, it's much harder to do that. And so that's why indeed there is a difference between shareholder value maximization, even in the broad sense of the term, and a purposeful purposeful business.
Is this at its heart an issue between the market trying to differentiate between short term and the long term? Is it a time issue here?
Part of it is indeed a time issue, which is if you look to the long term, then many of the things that are undertaken to serve society do actually come out in the long term stock price. So then you might think, well, is purposeful business anything other than long term shareholder value maximization? And indeed, if you think about the word sustainable, right, sustainable doesn't mean anything different from long term. So you might think actually a focus on long term shareholder value is sustainable. But I'd still say there was another difference in addition to the horizon, which is your mentality instrumental or is it intrinsic? So what I mean by that is an instrumental mentality would be the following. If I want to take a long-term investment, like build a factory, I would do the net present value calculation I just mentioned. You calculate the number of widgets and you put them into the spreadsheet, and if the benefits outweigh the costs, I'm going to do that investment. However, you can't do that where there's an intangible investment like treating your workers better or building customer trust. It's really hard to calculate those benefits. So even if you had a long-term approach, you wouldn't engage in some investments like in employees or customer trust just because it's impossible to forecast the benefits. Now, the nice thing about the intrinsic approach is that, well, let's treat my workers better just because it's the right thing to do, just because these are humans, I care about their mental and physical wellness. And then what my research shows is that this approach of actually being more flexible and not needing to quantify anything, that unexpectedly does pay off in the long term. So even if the true reason for caring about society is intrinsic rather than instrumental, unexpectedly, these things pay off in the future. So the key thing here is uncertainty. So in a world of perfect certainty, yes, we would evaluate every investment, both tangible and intangible, with a calculation. But in a world of uncertainty, that highlights the limitations of this calculation-based approach, and this means that actually you might further increase shareholder value by actually not focusing on shareholder value and seeing it as a byproduct rather than the end goal.
And you mentioned that you've done some analysis on this. How do you go about measuring this type of attitude or this intrinsic perspective?
This is really critical, right? Because if you don't have the evidence behind it, everything I've just said would be wishful thinking, right? I would just be asking you to believe that, oh, if we do the right thing, yeah, we're going to be more profitable in the long term. So this is where I come to this as a finance professor, and that mathematical approach that I mentioned earlier is useful, even though this is a very human question. So one thing I want to do was to look at in my own research, what is the link between a company which is truly purposeful and long-term returns? Now, the challenge here is how do I measure, well, is the company truly purposeful? So what I did in one of my studies was I looked at how well a company treats its workers. Now, you might think, well, employee satisfaction, that's only one dimension of purpose. It's not about the environment or fair tax. But while I looked at employees, as I had a really good measure, which was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. That's a list of companies that treat their workers really well. And importantly, not just on pay, but on all the other dimensions like meaningful work and having a voice in how the companies run. And that was available from 1984. So that's important because by the time I finished the data collection in 2011, I had 28 years. And so why is that critical? Because a purpose is sort of a pretty new thing. And most of the data sources might be available for the past 10 years. And then to one of your earlier points, Bella, you mentioned, oh, is purpose just a luxury, a nice thing to have? If my data set had only been in the good times, then you might think, well, maybe in the bad times, it's something that you should cut. So my 28 years had both booms and recession. And so to cut a long story short, what I needed to do is to show, well, are companies that treat their workers well, do they do better in the long term, or are they just fluffy companies who are distracted from the bottom line? Now, there's loads of things that we need to get through, like causation versus correlation. Is it employee satisfaction that leads to profits, or profits that lead to employee satisfaction? But let me just skip that. That's in the book if people are interested. What is the big punchline for practitioners? It is that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year. So that's 89 to 184% compounded. So that's financially material. It's not just wishful thinking. That's something that everybody should take seriously.
There have been lots of attempts to try to get companies to be more responsible and more in tune with the values of society. There's lots of reforms, in the UK, US, not just in the Anglo-Saxon economies, but everywhere there's always these policies around executive pay them more in options or stock rather than cash. There's shareholder activism, get somebody onto the board to redirect the company. These types of reforms and actions, how do you think that intersects with your thesis?
So I think some of these reforms are well-intentioned, but I think they might be fundamentally misguided because of the mentality that they have. So what they assume is a fixed pie. So what I mean by this is that the value that a company creates, and notice I'm talking about social value, not financial value, that can be given by a pie. And so that pie could either be divided between investors in the form of profits or society in the form of fairer wages or better stewardship of the environment. And so if the pie is fixed, you think that the only way to give more to society is to take away from investors and executives. So if you think about the pay reforms that you're mentioning, we're looking at the pay ratio, the idea that high pay to the CEO is at the expense of everybody else. Sometimes we look at, let's try to restrict shareholder rights and stop shareholder activism. So that's what some senators in the US are arguing, under the guise that shareholders are taking profits away from everybody else. But that's wrong. So the reason why the book is called Grow the Pie is actually the size of the pie is not fixed, is that it's perfectly possible for a company to make a lot of profits and also deliver a lot of social value. Just by being innovative, just by being excellent, this can create value for both society and shareholders. So one recent example is Bob Iger of Disney. So he was paid $66 million, I think it was last year. And people said, well, that's outrageous. It was 1,000 times the average worker, as in he sort of created this high pay at the expense of everybody else. But if you look at how Disney had done over his tenure, the stock price had risen by about 600% when the broader market had gone up by 150%. And we don't just care about financial value, we care about people as well, and he created 70,000 jobs. So the reason why he was paid a lot was he'd just been a really, really successful CEO. And if pay is fair, it should be tied to performance. And so the way in which he would have avoided such high pay is if he had not been so successful, but then everybody was worse off. So what I want to move away from is this zero-sum thinking, is that it's either business or society. Instead, business is a positive-sum game. If indeed companies are innovative, if they treat their workers better, if they're driven by purpose, then they'll create social value and they'll also become profitable as a byproduct, but those profits are not at the expense of society. So I think some of the reforms which have this fixed pie mindset are a little misguided. So then what are the reforms which I think are good? Well, they're the ones which I think do allow shareholders to have greater voice. So something like the Shareholder Rights Directive, the Corporate Governance Code, and the Stewardship Code within the UK, which are encouraging companies and investors to think more long-term and make those intangible investments I alluded to in an earlier answer. Those are the things which I think are really going to move the needle.
Do you have a view on the continental European way of running companies versus the Anglo-Saxon way? So if you look at the German model, the French model, workers have a lot more rights. You often have trade unions on the board of these companies, whereas the Anglo-Saxon model is much more, well, appears to be give workers less rights and much more profit sort of focused. I mean, do you have a view on the two models?
Yes, thanks for asking this, because many people who argue for purposeful business argue we need to move away from the Anglo-Saxon models because they call it its shareholder primacy, under the assumption it's shareholders at the expense of everybody else because of the fixed pie mindset. Whereas in continental Europe, right, you have, say, workers on the boards. When actually, going back to the concepts, is that, well, shareholders, if they are creating value, it could well be that the way they make a company more profitable is not by saying cut wages and scrap investment, but by making the company more productive. Whereas if you have workers on the boards, it could well be that the workers are perhaps preserving jobs at the expense of wider society and not just shareholders. So if you were, say, an energy company, it might be employees on the boards are stopping, say, moving away from fossil fuels by shutting down coal-fired power stations. So absolutely workers matter, but also there's other stakeholders as well. Now, everything I've said so far has been conceptually, I've said the word might, but again, what do I want to do as an academic? I want to look at the evidence. And so the evidence is, if you take the most controversial shareholders, which are hedge fund activists, often if you look at the popular belief, they extract value from society by forcing wages to be cut. But interestingly, what the research finds is that, yeah, hedge funds do make a company more profitable, but by just improving productivity. And they do that not by firing workers, but by making the company more innovative. So what we do want is actually, the beauty of shareholders is that the research I mentioned previously is that things that are taken to benefit the society in the long term, like employee satisfaction, they ultimately come and benefit shareholders. So shareholders will take into account all of the stakeholders out there, employees, customers, the environment, and so on. Whereas workers on the board, they might be focused too much on workers at the expense of other stakeholders. Now, clearly, a company which is focused on shareholders should still take workers really seriously by making sure we have worker panels and finding ways to take an employee voice, but they should do so in addition to all of the other stakeholders. And so what's important is a balance of all those stakeholders. And so a board which is indeed acting in shareholders' interests, they would only be able to act in long-term shareholder interests if they took into consideration all of the stakeholders that are material to a company.
Yes, that makes sense. In fact, kind of on the macroeconomic side, there's been a lot of literature on labor market economics where they look at the insider-outsider issue for workers. So people employed by companies have so much protections, it makes it harder for outsiders to get jobs at those companies, and that often hurts younger demographics often. So there's kind of a generational issue that sort of comes into play. It can also impact minority groups often as well, who may be viewed as kind of outsiders. So there's kind of a lot of literature that also talks about some of the sort of issues of having, workers on the boards of companies.
That's a great point, because often people think, well, we need worker representation in the boardroom for workers to be represented. But a worker representative will never be truly representative. It will be one person or maybe three people from the workforce. And indeed, there was a great study looking at worker representation in Germany, looking at what happens to jobs in a downturn. And you find that, well, jobs are preserved. You might think, well, that's great. Shouldn't that be what happens? Is that we should protect jobs in the downturn rather than shedding them? But interestingly, what were the jobs that were preserved? They were white-collar jobs. Why? Because who gets elected to become a worker representative? It's somebody who will be white-collar, who will be eloquent, and who will be able to conduct him or herself sort of professionally in the meeting and so on. So they may well look out for white-collar jobs or skilled blue-collar jobs at the expense of unskilled blue-collar jobs or minorities. And so that could be the challenge, is that the worker representative could look out for his or her specific worker group. Whereas if the directors are representing shareholders and those are long-term oriented shareholders, then they will recognize that the success of a company is underpinned by all of its workforce, not just the skilled white-collar workers.
Now, you've mentioned purpose a few times, and I thought it might be useful for you to kind of define what you mean by purpose, and then maybe at a more practical level, how do companies introduce the concept of purpose, and how can they use it as a management objective?
Well, it's great that you're pushing me on this, because we often hear the word purpose banded around without it ever being defined, and often people define purposeful to mean altruistic, right? So a purposeful company is an altruistic company. But if you look at sort of etymologically, I'm going back to my English A-level here, right? The word purposeful, it means targeted or focused. So a purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I'm doing it deliberately. So purpose also needs to have a focused aspect to it. So sometimes I see companies with purpose statements such as, we care about employees and customers and the environment and shareholders and suppliers and communities. But that's not targeted. That tries to be all things to all people. And it's really meaningless, because if you go back into the situation where we talked about this energy company thinking, do I shut down a coal-fired power station? That's good for the environment. It's bad for workers. So if your purpose was to serve the environment and workers, it doesn't provide you with that clarity. So I think purpose is the answer to the question, how is the world a better place by your company being here? So what is the one thing so that you do to change the world? And so just like a citizen, when asked what his or her purpose was, they might say it's to be a doctor or a teacher or an entrepreneur. It wouldn't be to be all of those things. And similarly for a company, let's say an energy company, it might be to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. And if that is your purpose, well, you might understand that that might involve shedding some workers. Let's look at a non-Anglo-Saxon company. Let's look at Baidu in China. That's to use technology to make the world simpler. Inherent in that is the view that might involve, in some cases, not maximizing the number of workers that we have. And there might be other companies with a strong employee focus, and that would be a different purpose. And that's fine, right? Different companies have different purposes, just like different people have different careers, but you should be focused on which ones are most meaningful. And that goes then to your second question, Bilal, on how do companies know what purposes, what projects to start, is I think one of the really important things about purpose is comparative advantage, is what are the societal challenges that you can move the needle on given your expertise. So as an analogy, so let's take, say, a bank. They might think, oh, climate change is the massive problem of the day, right? We've got Extinction Rebellion and the like, but actually your impact on climate change as a bank is not going to be as massive as, say, an energy company or a mining company. So instead you might think, well, it's financial inclusion is the really big thing that we might be able to change, and so you might choose to focus on that. So I think comparative advantage is the thing that should sort of underpin what projects to lead with.
Actually, now that you mentioned finance, one question I did want to ask you was, what's your view of the financial sector? Now, obviously, I come from finance. That's my background, and a lot of my audience and clients I speak to are in the finance sector. So there is this perspective, that the financial sector is parasitic in some way, that it's extractive, of overall industry, and it promotes or over-promotes short-termism. Do you have a take on the role of the financial sector?
Yes, and again, I will answer this just by looking at evidence, because I think that's my strength, but I think that's also what's needed, because otherwise you can say things which just sound good, and if you write an article saying the financial sector are parasites, that will just play to public opinion, and it's going to be liked and shared and retweeted. So let's look at that. And even if you just look at the most basic figures, right? What are the most valuable companies in the world today? A lot of them are tech companies with valuations way above their earnings. So just looking at something like that, that suggests that actually this idea of short-termism isn't as obvious as one might think, even though, as I acknowledged earlier, markets aren't perfectly efficient. There's certain things like employee satisfaction which don't show up in the immediate short term. So then let's look at some specific ways in which I think the financial sector is much more long-term than one might think. One way is indeed shareholder activism, is indeed if you have hedge funds trying to transform a company, they're doing so by changing its long-term health by looking at productivity and innovation. A second thing is share buybacks, which you asked me about earlier, but I apologize, I didn't respond to that point. But share buybacks, often people think, well, what you're doing is pursuing short-term value. You're buying back shares because of greedy investors wanting it, and you're cutting investment to do that. Well, again, let's look at the evidence. The evidence shows that when a company announces a share buyback, its stock price jumps in the short term, but in the long term, it goes up even more. And the third thing to look at is the idea of trading. So people think, well, trading in financial markets is really excessive. We have short-termist investors who are dumping stock too much. Let's have what they call patient capital, which is the idea that shareholders should be locked in for the long term. And this is changing law, right? These beliefs have changed law. In France, you have the Loi Florange, which doesn't give investors full voting rights until they've held their shares for, I believe it's 2 years. But this fundamentally confuses two things. One of them is the holding period of the investor. Do you hold for the short term or the long term? And the other is the orientation of the investor, is that when you choose to sell, are you choosing to sell based on short-term or long-term information? Now, it's indeed true that if an investor who dumps a stock after 3 months because you've missed your quarterly earnings target, that's not good. But many investors sell based on long-term information. So in about 2016, I believe, Ford had announced record profits for 2 years in a row, but investors didn't care because they were worried that they weren't investing enough in self-driving cars or electric cars. They dumped the stock because of that long-term information, and that led to CEO Mark Fields being fired. So that is a case of which, well, investors do trade, but what they trade on is long-term information. And so what might seem to be short-term selling is actually holding a company accountable for not thinking about the long term. And while that might be one anecdote, again, what I look at in the book is large-scale evidence to find that that is more generally the case.
I mean, you mentioned on share buybacks, I'm quite intrigued by that work that finds that even in the long run, companies that do buybacks see their stocks outperform. Now, why would that be?
Yeah, this is really important because often people think that, well, investment is how you create long-term value. So Elizabeth Warren said the real value of a company comes through investment. And if you're doing a share buyback, right, you're not investing. So isn't it automatic that the company should be underperforming? Well, the answer is no, because as you know from Basic Finance 101, right, investment only adds value if the benefits of the investment exceed the cost. And so a purposeful and responsible company indeed does take investments, and does take investments even if, in some cases, you can't fully calculate the benefits, like investing in your workers, but also shows restraint. So you know when you've taken all your good investment opportunities, you don't want to go further. And going back to the football analogy we started this podcast with, right? Let's take a great football manager. People recognize you don't want to spend your money on everything, right? So once you've accumulated your starting 11, there's no point in amassing further players to sit on the bench. And so a good football manager knows when he's sort of taking all the right investments. And that's the same with a company. So I don't like hearing the accusation, if a company has done a share buyback, then the CEO must have no great ideas. She can't think of anything better to do than to buy back shares. No, that's not the case. Right, just like a good football manager or a good film editor who's added enough scenes and knows we don't need to add further scenes, they know when to stop. And then when they decided to stop, then rather than hoarding the rest of the cash and that cash sitting idle and not adding value to society, by engaging in a share buyback, then the financial sector then reallocates that cash to growing companies and allows those growing companies to undertake investments. So again, I think a lot of the criticism of share buybacks is really partial and narrow-minded. They're saying, well, if you buy back shares, right, money flows out of a company and it can't invest. Yeah, that's true, but where do you think that money goes? It doesn't just disappear, right? That money can be reallocated elsewhere. So we can only have the active funding of new and fledgling businesses if mature businesses are allowed to return capital. Maybe the US is arguably the country which most finances these fledgling businesses. And it can only do that because it's also active in shareholder payout in the form of profits and dividends.
Do you have a view on ESG policies, environmental social governance policies? That's become a big theme in the financial sector. There's lots of funds that have been launched to focus on ESG. How do you think about that?
The premise of the book and my thinking is that ESG factors, which historically had been seen as non-financial factors, to be thought of only by socially responsible investment funds, are actually financial. So even if your only role as an investor is to make as much money as possible, you don't care about social goals. And notice that's fine because you could be a pension fund and your goal is to make money for your beneficiaries. You should still care about these ESG factors because they're not non-financial factors, they're financially material. If you look at the future of investing, what are the things that finance professors like me have said for the last 50 years? They said, look at dividends, look at profits, look at valuation ratios, look at credit ratings. But all those things nowadays, they can be done by a computer. So we have smart beta funds now trading on momentum and size and so on. So if you want to form an investment strategy based on that, you're probably going to be outsourced to artificial intelligence. Instead, some of these ESG factors are ones that you might not be able to evaluate as a computer. It might involve visiting some companies and visiting the shops and seeing how customers and workers are being treated. So those are things which are not going to be in the stock price. Well, investors can only make money through market inefficiencies. The market is really efficient at taking into account many financial factors. It's inefficient at taking into account ESG factors. So even if you're just a financial investor, not a socially responsible investor, you should consider these ESG factors seriously.
What does the literature say about the individual components of ESG, the E, the S, and the G? Like, which one of those tends to be the one that really pushes the needle in terms of performance?
Sometimes people present the literature into a one-sided way. So Hargreaves Lansdown came out with this missive last year saying study after study shows that ESG funds outperform. And that gives the impression ESG always outperforms. And that plays to confirmation bias, right? Because we'd love to believe that ethical companies do better. But that is actually not the case, right? What the evidence shows is that it's only material ESG factors that matter. So if you go back to my definition of purpose, it's about being focused and targeted, not playing to every single stakeholder. And similarly, what the evidence suggests is there's certain factors which are material. So governance is typically material across most companies. Employees are typically material across most companies. But for some of the other E and S factors, it depends sector by sector. So if you're in agriculture or minerals and mining, the environment matters a lot, because if there's a flood, then that's going to disrupt your business. But if you're a bank, well, if there's a flood, that might not affect you as much. But what will affect you is something like breach of customer trust. So for you as a bank, maybe you want to focus much more on fair marketing and advertising. So materiality does matter. And again, what that means is that good ESG is context specific. And again, this suggests that it's not something you can automatically program into a computer. We need to understand the context. And this is why I always think that even in a world of artificial intelligence, this is something where human investors, if they do it in a discerning way, will always have an advantage. So I do believe there will always be a role for active management.
Yeah, that's reassuring and hopeful for humans over the robots. I guess the critique of ESG is that many companies are gaming the system, where they introduce policies or fill the right forms out to make sure that they meet certain ESG standards. So it looks on the surface like they meet those standards, when in reality, that's more of a on paper exercise rather than the reality.
Yeah, you could put like a minority on the board to tick the box and not change anything in terms of diversity in the workforce more generally. Or you could look at demographic diversity without changing cognitive diversity. And sort of those are things which a smart beta fund might pick up, is just looking at demographic diversity, whereas a human investor might actually talk to management and ask them and grill them on what are the ways in which you encourage cognitive diversity through encouraging a psychologically safe place to work, and how do you make sure that failure is not punished, and so on. So all of those things, I think that's what diversity is truly about, but it's something that I think a computer would never be able to fully grasp.
And so far, we haven't actually talked about COVID. It's been a huge shock to society, the economy, the world, and companies are responding in different ways. So we've had some high-profile cases of companies announcing layoffs at large scale. Other companies have held back, and instead, some have used government schemes, others haven't used government schemes. When you think about purposeful companies, is there like a right way of responding to this type of crisis that we're in right now?
Yeah, so I think going back to purpose, it's how's the world a better place by your company being here? It's to try to create social value rather than going after short-term financial returns. And so then what does that mean? Well, I think this is the benefit of looking at purpose through a pie growing rather than pie splitting lens. So what does a pie splitting response to crisis involve? Well, this might be Unilever giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer and guaranteeing the jobs of its 150,000 workers. And those are great things. So it's fantastic that Unilever can do that. It is splitting the pie differently by shareholders taking less of the pie and society getting more. But the problem with pie splitting is not every company can engage in pie splitting. What if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry? You don't have products to donate? Or what if you can't afford to keep paying your workers because it's just commercial suicide? So the whole idea of pie growing is that responsibility is about being excellent and innovative. So what does innovation mean? This might be some companies which have nothing to do with the coronavirus, but pivoting. So it could be Burberry making hospital masks and gowns rather than luxury clothing. It could be LVMH not making perfumes, but instead making sanitizer. Also, what does it mean to be responsible with respect to your employees? Now, let me be clear that it should not be the case for every company to always preserve jobs. Right, a company's role is to preserve jobs if they can give workers jobs that create value for society. Now, there are some companies in Japan, like Panasonic and Toshiba, where the workers used to make magnetic tape. They're out of a job, they won't fire them. They'll keep them within what's known as banishment rooms and make them review security footage. That creates no value for society. It doesn't give them human dignity. There are, unfortunately, as part of COVID, certain sectors which will permanently have to downsize, such as travel. So Airbnb, they had to let go of their workers. That's just the commercial right decision. It's also the purposeful decision. There's no point keeping workers in when they're not going to be adding value to society. But what they did was they took a purposeful approach to that, is they went above and beyond in terms of, well, how to make sure that those employees were well treated. For example, by giving them far more notice pay than they needed to, keeping their health benefits for, I think, for a year, allowing them to keep their laptop because they recognize, well, that's critical for them finding a new job. So again, thinking about what they could do to treat their workers as well as possible, even in the really tough situation where, because of commercial reality, you had to let them go.
I thought that we could also talk about some of the other things that you focus on. I know that you're a man of many talents, and I saw that you've actually given many lectures on things like personal productivity and time management and those sorts of things. So maybe we could talk a bit about those. So what's your interest in those areas, and do you have any tips for us?
Thank you very much. And so you might think it's weird for a finance professor to talk about these topics. So where Bilal might have seen this is, in addition to my position at London Business School, I'm a professor at Gresham College. So Gresham's mission is to give free lectures to the public, just like Michael Faraday used to give about science. And so my first lecture series was on how business can better serve society, which is all of the topics that we've discussed. And my current lecture series is called Business Skills for the 21st Century. So things like time management and mental and physical well-being and so on. And you might think, well, why did I get involved in this? Well, first is the recognition that I needed to improve on these things myself. So in order to be working in academic research and in policy and practice, I needed to manage my time better. I needed to make sure that I prioritize my mental and physical well-being to be effective. So I wanted to take a research approach to this. So yeah, there's loads of sort of time management gurus out there, but let me try and study how best to do this, and then to share that research with other people. I think also a linkage is that many of the things we've talked about have a really long-term element. So investing in your mental and physical well-being is something with a long-term payoff, even though in the short term it's painful. And that's the same with a purposeful company, right? To invest in your workers for the long term, you're going to have to sacrifice some profit in the short term, but there's that very common link. And so that common link will allow me to give, hopefully, a brief answer to your question, what are some tips? Well, there's loads of sort of specific tips, which are in the Gresham series, which you can find on my website. All of this is freely available. But I think the one thing in common is, if you think again about what purpose means, is about being focused and selective, and purpose for a company being as much about saying what you're not doing as what you are doing. That's the same with time management and mental and physical wellness. Is the reason why we're so exhausted and we can't manage our time is we're not able to say no to things. What this allows me to do, a purposeful life, is to say no to things with a clear conscience. So within London Business School, I have to admit, I am not involved as much in the PhD program as many of my colleagues. That's not because I'm lazy, but that's a recognition that my comparative advantage is my connection with practitioners and policymakers. Just because I came from the real world from my time at Morgan Stanley, that's what my research is about. So let me focus on that. And in order to be really effective in that, I need to keep in touch with the real world. And so to buy that time, I can't spend as much time on the PhD program. I'm lucky to have some great colleagues who are much better PhD mentors than me. And so they are the ones who are doing more of that. And I'm doing more of the public engagement and the putting research into practice.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. The sort of the focus and the learning to say no without guilt, I suppose, is the lesson there.
Absolutely, yes. So you don't need to solve all of the world's problems. So just like as a company, right, if you're a bank, right, yes, climate change is a major crisis, but actually financial inclusion might be where you're going to solve it. Similarly here, as a person, right, you might be daunted by all of the problems in the world, but there are billions of people in the world, and you want to focus on the problems that you think you're best placed to serve, and that could well involve saying no to things with a clear conscience, with knowing that you can only say yes to something else and be really effective at it if you're stringent about saying no to other things. So sorry for this really corny phrase that I'm going to say now, but this is I call the Spice Girl strategy. Don't do what you want to do, but what you really, really want to do. So why is that, right? Yeah, there's loads of things that we could be doing with our time, which are 8 out of 10 things. They'd score 8 out of 10 in how much satisfaction they give us and so on. But the essence of time management is we've got so many 8 out of 10 things. We want to do only the 10 out of 10 things, which are really in our sweet spot of what we care about and what we're skilled at. And if we focus on what we want, but what we really, really want to do, I think that gives us a lot less stress and a lot less burnout.
And I can see that with all that spare time you now have with your improved time management, you engage in a number of other things outside of work. I'm on your Instagram account, if you didn't know already, but you seem to do a lot of athletic stuff. stuff. So marathons, Ironmans. Where did that interest come from?
I think that also just comes from the fact these things are beneficial for you in the long term. But I also don't want to look at it in a purely instrumental aspect, like I'm doing this to improve my fitness for later in life. I just really find this fun. Is that my job does involve sitting at a desk or writing or solving some equations in my spare time. I don't typically sit and read books or watch movies. I want to do something physical, and so I love that aspect. And it's also what's nice about it, it involves other people, because when you sit and write a book, you're just doing that by yourself. But when you're playing in a team sport, or even doing an individual fitness exercise, like being in a gym, when you're surrounded by other people pushing themselves, I really enjoy this. And so one of the things that I do as a professor at London Business School, which might seem really weird and unusual for professors, I actually take some of my students to Barry's Boot Camp, which is a boutique gym which has got extremely high quality sessions. And why do I do that? Is just to instill to them the importance of mental and physical well-being, and also to dispel the myth that this involves being shouted at and beasted in an aggressive manner for an hour. These things are also fun. So a lot of things, and there's a lot of research I've looked at on happiness, is that what are the things that make us happy? It's not always sitting on a beach and drinking pina colada, but things that are stretching are things that make our mind happy, and things that are also physically stretching, while at the time, okay, that might cause a little bit of discomfort, afterwards they also lead to a lot of growth and happiness and satisfaction.
Now I think I'll be scared to go to your lectures if it ends up meaning I have to go to Barry's boot camp afterwards.
I think also the other thing just to recognize is that I shouldn't impose my beliefs on people, is that, like, in general, and I know what you said was in jest, but I think in general, like, different people have what they think to be cool. So for some people it might be fitness, others it might be sort of more low intensity things like yoga. For others it might be things like music. But again, if I go back to the pie analogy, often people think, well, if I'm doing all of these other things, that's at the expense of time I could be working harder, not recognizing that these times sort of in personal rest, these actually grow the pie in terms of they make you more effective. I used to do some sports coaching. So it was when I was in America, I was the head running coach at the American Cancer Society, and sort of that involved quite a lot of public speaking, which is something I need to do now in terms of the job. So often we compartmentalize different things in different parts of our lives, but I think a lot of these things are a homogenous whole, and yet you don't do those other things to develop the skill in public speaking to apply to your lectures, but it's more the fact that the idea that if you're doing things that are fun, they're regenerative, and unexpectedly, it may well be that they give you some skills that you can apply in the business world.
I'm sure we could talk on for much longer, but I think let's wrap up our conversation there. I just wanted to ask, how do people get hold of your book? And then also, how do people in general follow your work?
Thanks very much, Bill, for asking that. So the book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. So you can get that from Amazon or any other bookseller. There's multiple formats. There's the hard copy, there's Kindle. There's also the audiobook, which I chose to read myself. Why? Because this is something that I'm personally passionate about. It's not just a topic of research to me, so I wanted to read that out myself. But there's also the book's website, growthepie.net. And so why I put that out is that there's many things that happened in responsible business which took place after the book was finished, such as Extinction Rebellion or the coronavirus crisis. So I wanted to blog about that just to keep people interested. But more generally than that, I'm on Twitter or Instagram at Edmans, that's AEDMANS, and also on LinkedIn. And what I try to do in all of those things is, just like the book, is not just to promote my own work, but there's lots of other work on responsible business that loads of other great people are doing. And also there's some work which is out there which disagrees with my viewpoint, and I also want to promote that. As long as that work is rigorous and well done, what I think is necessary is to understand that these are complex topics. I have views on these topics, but my view is not always right, and there's research which shows different things. And I think the way in which we can actually put this into practice is understand the complex and beautiful shades of grey in a topic which is often just portrayed as black and white. And so what I hope to do through all of those channels is to give sort of the broader perspective on these issues.
That's great. And I'll include links to all of those in our show notes as well. So with that, I just wanted to thank you, Alex. That was an excellent conversation. I'm sure our listeners will learn much from it.
Thanks very much, Bill. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and let other people know about the show. Also, sign up to become a subscriber to our research at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.